Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam.
I'm Achol. Last week, the High Court made a decision in a landmark case that will no doubt have major implications for Australian employees. It opens the door for workers to sue their employer for poor mental health after being unfairly dismissed.
It's funny because this almost seems like an inevitable part of an unfair dismissal case. The idea that that would be an unpleasant experience that would cause at least some level of mental harm didn't really surprise me. It's an incredibly traumatic experience for all parties involved, and it does make sense that we're talking about mental harm in the process of a dismissal. But now it's been tested in front of Australia's highest court. And what I think we're going to see after this decision, which you're about to take us through, is it becoming part of how employers actually think about their behaviour during the dismissal process. But let's slow down. Why don't we take this in two parts, Achol? First, take me through the actual case and what happened, and then let's look at what the High Court had to say.
Okay, so this is quite a long story that kind of develops over the last 5 years.
As these cases often are.
Yep. So the High Court ruling last week centres around the unfair dismissal of a man called Adam Alicia. So he worked for Vision Australia for almost a decade, and in his last role there, he was an adaptive technology consultant, and that's relevant to the story. Alicia's role basically required him to travel across Australia where he would set up technology for vision-impaired people in their homes and offices. Now, the court document shows that towards the end of his time there, he wasn't really having a good time. So he was treated for anxiety and depression related to sound sensitivity issues, or that's what court documents describe them as. And that was among other things such as workplace stress and issues with his colleagues.
Interesting. So he was having problems at work. He was having these sound sensitivity issues which were directly impacting his job working with sound, and that was causing stress and that was causing conflict with colleagues. Was that part of the reason why he was actually fired?
Well, yes and no. So in 2015, while he was on a work trip in rural Victoria, Alicia made a noise complaint at the hotel he was staying at, right? But then after his stay, the hotel actually made a complaint to his employer, alleging that he was aggressive and intimidating during that interaction.
Right, so not a good stay at a hotel. He complains about the sound. The hotel complains about his behaviour. It's then in Vision Australia's court to respond. How did they respond to that?
So actually, it wasn't immediately dealt with because he went on annual leave.
Right. Okay, so he goes on annual leave after this trip, which had some issues. And when he comes back, that's when the problems start.
Exactly. So the issue was referred up to the HR department. But what was interesting was their reaction to the complaint. Basically, management said it wasn't surprised and that his behaviour had gotten worse.
And so I imagine there were conversations that were happening whilst this employee was on his annual leave. He gets back to work, management wants to have a chat with him. How did that then pan out?
On Alicia's first day back from annual leave, he was given a letter explaining that he was being stood down because of what happened at the hotel. And this is where the legal issues seemed to arise. So he was told to return to the office in 2 days, where he was going to be given the opportunity to kind of explain himself. Along with that, Alicia was given strict orders not to speak to any other staff members or he would be immediately fired.
It's interesting how this one has panned out, and I guess we only know so much about it because it's been detailed in the court documents, but he did get fired. He didn't get fired, though, for talking to his colleagues, though.
That's right. So at the meeting, Alicia denied these allegations, but he was still fired.
Okay, so we have an employee who's dismissed because of what management says is a pattern of behaviour that kind of all accumulated in this incident at a hotel in Victoria. I'm normally the person who kind of explains the legal stuff here at TDA, but you've really owned this story and this reporting over the last week. I want you to try and run with it. Talk me through what happened then when Alicia brings a case of unfair dismissal against Vision Australia to the courts.
Okay, so I'll give you the Spark Notes version without all the legal jargon. Alicia first filed an unfair dismissal case with the Fair Work Commission, and that was a couple months after he was fired. What actually happened was Vision Australia settled and agreed to pay him more than $27,000.
Which is not unusual for employers to try and kind of make something go away and for it to not eventuate into a years-long case. But that's exactly what's happened here. They settled, but then it landed up back in court, right?
Yeah, and that happened years later. So in 2020, he launched a case in the Victorian Supreme Court. And basically, he alleged that his termination breached his employment contract. And he argued that that firing caused depression and left him with no capacity to work for the foreseeable future.
Interesting.
So that was the lengthy process. And what ended up happening was the court ruled in his favour, calling the dismissal unfair, unjust, and wholly unreasonable. And basically, Vision Australia was ordered to pay him $1.4 million.
So it's interesting. It sounds like it's moved from a case at the Fair Work Commission where it has settled quite quickly to a more substantive case in the Supreme Court, which is much more about Alicia's ability to have ongoing employment. And he would have argued that because of that traumatic experience, he's lost all of these earnings that he could have gotten over the next, couple of decades even. It's a big penalty for Vision Australia to pay. $1.4 million is a lot. What did they say when that judgment was handed down?
Well, they reacted like any other company that wouldn't want to pay a former employee $1 million.
Yeah.
And they actually appealed the decision. And in court, they argued that Alicia shouldn't have been paid that much money for two main reasons.
Okay, and this is the really important bit. This forms the basis of their appeal. Let's go through it. Number one.
Hey, I'm Nish. I'm TDA's lead developer, and I'm just going to play you some elevator music so you can hit subscribe. Enjoy. Hopefully that's enough time for you to go subscribe.
Okay, so number one, under Australian law, Alicia wasn't entitled to damages from poor mental health resulting from the breached contract.
Okay, so break that down. That means that Vision Australia tried to argue there's nothing in Australian law that says if you're sacked, you are entitled to damages if you are mentally harmed because of that incident. Okay, so then what's number two?
So number two, Vision Australia basically tried to argue that his poor mental health post-firing was actually a product of his pre-existing mental health conditions.
And we've talked through that before. That was part of how Vision Australia kind of diagnosed his behaviour at that hotel and led to his sacking. So Vision Australia takes this decision from the Supreme Court and appeals it. And that's where we get to the High Court, which is why we're talking about this today. We've just had a decision from the High Court. Take me through what they said.
Well, the High Court actually overturned Vision Australia's appeal and supported the original ruling, which was in favour of Alicia. And that original ruling basically called his firing a sham and a disgrace.
Okay, and that's really interesting because the High Court is when the decisions are made that actually can't be appealed anymore unless there's some sort of new evidence or anything. What are the wider implications here then if we have that decision?
So High Court judgments set legal precedents, which are basically cases that establish the rules and principles subsequent cases with similar facts and issues must follow. And usually these cases are the first of their kind.
Which kind of is what happened here.
Absolutely. Like you said, High Court decisions can't be appealed.
Yeah.
So this basically is the definite end of a case like this.
And so in reality, what this means is that Australian workers, because of this High Court decision, now have grounds to sue for damages relating to a psychiatric injury after they're dismissed unfairly. And it's a really interesting one, Achol, because what often happens in these sorts of employment scenarios where something is tested for the first time in the court is that then we often find employers having to respond to not get in danger themselves from this new rule of the game, essentially. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see new policies in the workplace around how we preserve the mental health of our employees when there is an investigation into potential misbehaviour or when there's disciplinary action taken, or at the very extreme, when there is a dismissal process. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we should be caring for the mental health of employees who are going through something like that, despite the fact the relationship has broken down.
Yeah, and it's taken us quite a while to get there. And it'll be interesting to see how workplace lawyers kind of respond to this major decision made last week.
Very interesting. We're going to keep tabs on this story because I know this type of story really does have relevance to a lot of people who are in the workforce, particularly young people. Achol, thank you so much for taking us through that. You passed your legal bar exam with flying colours. And thank you for joining us on the Daily Aus this morning. If you're listening to this podcast on Spotify or Apple, it would absolutely make our week. It was my birthday last week. It would make my birthday.
Woo!
If you pressed subscribe or follow or gave this episode 5 stars. Let's climb up the ranks towards the end of the year. If you're watching on YouTube, click follow on this channel and we're going to have an incredible episode of journalism for you every weekday morning. We'll be back again this afternoon with the headlines. Until then, see you later.